possible to stop sharing the slides so I can see everybody?
Yeah, if you put I don't know if you can see everyone at the same time, Molly. I'll stop.
I can't, Claire. Yeah, if you can stop sharing, I can't see everyone.
There we are. Now I can see you all. Yeah, because I've only seen a few people. So hello, it's so nice to be with you. It's very nice to join you virtually. It'd be much nicer to be in Glasgow itself because, as I said to some people, my daughter's there, and so I'm a sort of fairly regular visitor these days. And I've got to say that it's quite a struggle being in England at the moment. And the reason I chose this subject, which is about, you know, the importance of pluralist politics, is because, as Nigel said, I can't be an MEP anymore, and I couldn't get to be an MP. And I think we're really struggling in the UK and in England particularly because of the just lack of a lot of representation in Parliament and this sort of stranglehold of the two-party system. And obviously in Scotland that's quite different. And I'm sort of taking a lot of hope from the way Scottish politics is working, and it feels a lot more familiar from what I know from the European Union. And yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Europe with the European Green Deal, and then a few other issues that might be at risk because of us leaving the EU, and then just reflecting a little bit on how politics can be framed in such a way that it works well for the environment. So the first thing probably to say is that the agenda and the issues we all care about have never had a higher profile than they have now. And so we talk about that from a political point of view as being the green wave, you know, and seeing green parties receiving more votes and going into government and being able to influence the agendas of government. And we see that particularly at the moment in Ireland, where although they're quite a small party, the Irish Greens held the balance of power, and they've able to get some really impressive climate targets and transport policies and so on put into national policy. But at the same time, we hear an awful lot of words about the environment, especially about climate, that don't necessarily connect very well with actions. And we were really quite critical of the 10-point plan that the government came out with, which just really didn't connect up to anything in terms of a realistic plan for tackling the climate emergency. I have to say I'm incredibly enthused about what happened in Washington yesterday and the fact that the US has come back into the Paris Climate Agreement. Of course, it was just such a dreadful 4 years with Trump in the White House. But of course, we have to keep our eye on Biden now and make sure that he does follow through with real action. But just the fact that he made rejoining the Paris Agreement such a priority that he signed the executive order immediately. He's got a fantastic team working on that. He's put John Kerry there as the climate czar or climate envoy, I think he's called, and all of these things bode really well, I would say. And unusually for us here in the Southwest, we're going to become the focus of interest when the G7 comes here in June, and the sort of environmentalists of Cornwall are all ready to organise an alternative G7, and then we'll be coming to Glasgow for an alternative COP at the end of the year. So between us, we'll have the whole policy-making community of the world covered, won't we? I think we'll be throwing rotten fish at Boris Johnson in both places, actually. Anyway, so I think we've got a lot of focus now on the climate emergency, but of course the other crisis that we're in the middle of is the nature crisis and the biodiversity crisis. And certainly when we're doing our communications, we always try and see those two things as two sides of the same coin, because as we all know, the incredible pressure that there is on wildlife and the destruction of habitats and the endless expansion of built up spaces into the natural environment is just causing devastating effects on natural life. And that is something that we have to address with the same urgency that's now being given towards the climate crisis. But I did want to start with a little bit of good news about the European Green Deal. I mean, the sort of bad news is that we're not going to be part of it, but the good news is that it's going ahead and it really is a significant programme. The target now is net zero carbon by 2050. And of course, that's a target we've had in the UK for some years. So in that sense, the EU's only just catching up. But the size of the programme, which is around €1 trillion, is really vast and on the sort of scale that you would expect to see from a number of governments who are really taking this agenda seriously. And we also have the European Investment Bank now turning itself into a climate bank. And this was something I was very focused on as a member of the European Parliament, sort of endlessly nagging the European Investment Bank about giving public funds, you know, because it's a public investment bank, giving public funds to oil pipelines and gas pipelines. And they finally now, after years of pressure, stopped doing that. And they are now focusing their investments on the green transition and on climate projects. And that, of course, the other side of that is that we no longer have access to those funds, and we don't have a public investment bank or any sort of climate bank here in the UK. So the level of spending from the Prime Minister was 12 billion for his climate plan, compared with 1 trillion euros in Europe and 2 trillion in the US. So I think that gives you a sense of the scale of the Prime Minister's ambition that's actually genuine as opposed to rhetoric. So the European Union's focused on transforming all sectors. I think we all understand now that the easiest and fastest is to decarbonise our electricity system, but we now have to rapidly move on to deal with transport and industry, and particularly focusing on the quality of our homes and our housing stock, which are incredibly wasteful of energy. And so it's decreasing energy demand is really the priority now, whether that's about buildings and homes or whether that's about transport systems. So we criticise the Prime Minister's 10-point plan as a wish list. And the biggest problem that everybody's making, the biggest mistake they're all making, is promising something in 30 years' time, when of course none of them will be politicians any longer. So whenever they make a proposal about like what they're going to achieve by 2040, our response has to be, what are you going to achieve next year? What are you going to achieve while you're still in power? And on that reckoning, the 10-point plan is extremely weak. And so we suggest instead the need to transform the whole economy by introducing a carbon tax. And that's something that I think we can really put pressure on leading up to the COP in Glasgow. And certainly subsidies only for new and emerging technologies. So no subsidies for nuclear, and certainly no subsidies for fossil fuels, which bizarrely they still offer, even at the same time as they're saying the right sort of things about climate. And then quite an important one that we made our test of the 10-point plan was to say, is this something we're going to achieve in this country? Because when the government does its carbon counting, it often offsets emissions by either using land in the majority world, you know, in countries where they've actually preserved their environments a lot better than we have, or else actually buying carbon credits from countries like Norway, who produce so much renewable energy that they can afford to sort of offshore some of the goodness to us. And that we just say, no way, we've got to tackle our own climate issues. We've got to make sure that reaching net zero carbon is about what we do here in the UK. We can't sort of push that burden either off onto some of the poorer countries of the world or some of the countries that are performing much better in terms of climate action. And then we have an important criterion around prioritising the local in climate action. So we don't want to see massive flagship projects. We want to see the local councils and the regional parliaments that are, and the national parliaments, as in Scotland, that are actually passing these climate emergency plans, having the cash to be able to implement them. It's a much more efficient way of addressing climate issues, and also a way that is much more able to be responsive to people's needs and much less likely to meet with resistance. And our final criterion is similar, which is to say that in response to, that everybody must be a winner as we make these climate investments. And that's not difficult to achieve, in the sense that warm homes, you know, better public transport, the sort of policies that you need to introduce to achieve energy efficiency actually genuinely do improve everybody's lives. So I'm actually, I mean, the whole climate issue is overwhelming and scary. And of course, it'll be there once we get through this overwhelmingly scary period of COVID. But I must say there's many signs for hope at the moment, largely about the fact that all the big economic blocs in the world have set a date for net zero carbon. And I think those of us that have been campaigning on climate should really not take credit for that, but really feel sort of warmed by the fact that that's happening. Because if you remember when it was you first thought, yes, we will eliminate fossil fuels from our economy, it felt like an enormous shift in mindset at that time, maybe 5 years ago. And yet now most of the big economic blocs in the world have accepted that that's going to happen. Their target dates are too late, but the global economy is turning away from fossil fuels, and that is an amazing and positive thing. So I would say our activities and our outrage and all our street activity and everything else has shifted. You know, it's brought climate to the top of the political agenda, and it's shifted policy in really significant ways. This is not true at all in terms of the nature emergency, which for most people, especially people who live in cities, I would say is still a hidden crisis. And, you know, they tend to see it because David Attenborough says it in a TV program, rather than it being something that's really connected with their everyday lives. Climate change is now meaningful for people in their everyday lives. They see extreme rainfall, they feel the much warmer summers and bizarre weather conditions. They know that's happening. Nature emergency, I would say, is much more hidden from most people, but the statistics on this are really stark. So 1 in 7 UK species at risk of extinction. And since the 1930s, 97% of ancient wildflower meadows have been destroyed, and 76%, there's been a 76% decline in flying insects since the 1990s, which is like 3/4 of the insects that were around when I was in my 30s or maybe 20s, I'm not sure, you know, have just disappeared. This is horrifying speed with which insects are disappearing. And again, we've got a bit of a problem there, because people are like, well, I don't really like insects. You know, that failure to grasp that it's about the system, it's about the ecology, it's about how all the species fit together. And people are grasping the fact that pollinators actually matter in terms of food. But I think that wider understanding of the web of life and how we're really tearing it apart at the moment is not widely understood. And what we need to do to address this is fairly fundamental changes, particularly in the way we use land and we grow food. Obviously, big reductions in pesticide use and in mechanical farming, and leaving wild spaces for nature to flourish. And in terms of land use, again, changing the sort of food that we eat, because the Green Party slogan is moving towards plant-based diets, which I really like, because it's not saying you can't eat meat or cheese, and it's accepting that people are making that transition at different rates. So if you eat this year half as much meat as you ate last year, that is a really important contribution in moving towards plant-based diets. And some people will have gone vegan this January, and that's a much bigger contribution, but we are all already on that path. And of course, if we change our diets away from meat and dairy, then we have a lot more land available, because we can feed ourselves with much less land if we have a plant-based diet. So we have that land available to now allow nature to flourish. And I think one of the encouraging things that's happened with COVID is that people have really appreciated nature in a way, whether that's a park or even a window box. People have realized how green spaces and plants and animals and birds and so on have kept them sort of sane and happy in really critical times. And so I think that's a good platform on which we can build to say, you know, we need to have these policies to protect our wild spaces and to really allow space for nature to flourish. And I just wanted to share as well, in case you haven't seen this, one of the things that's really encouraged me about Joe Biden is the team he's chosen to surround himself with, and the real diversity of that team. And Deb Haaland, who is a woman of Native American descent, has been put in charge of, I think they call it the Department of the Interior, which effectively means the sort of ancestral lands which were stolen from her people. And she gave a really amazing 3-minute speech when she accepted the nomination, in which she said, you know, one of the previous people holding my role had this mantra of towards Native Americans, which was civilize or exterminate. And I am living proof, she said, that policy failed. And it's quite extraordinary to think of somebody like that now having control over the national parks and the natural resources of the US. So if you haven't seen that video, just watch it, because it's very moving and very reinforcing, I think, to those of us who care about protecting the land. So just a few other issues to be aware of. I've mentioned biodiversity. It was of great concern, I think, to a lot of us that the UK, very soon after Brexit, gave permission for emergency use of neonicotinoid seed dressing for sugar beet. because we all know how damaging that pesticide is for bees, and obviously it's worrying to think that the deregulation after Brexit is going to include cutting these standards of environmental protection. We've got an issue with wild spaces and who's actually controlling those wild spaces. So we all know that having more access to natural, nature in its wild form, if you like, is really important. But I know this is a big issue in Scotland, particularly in Scotland. Who's actually going to own those grouse moors, and who's going to control and decide whether actually they are habitats for wildlife or not? And you probably know that Green MSP Alison Johnston has been very busy introducing legislation to protect foxes and hares and raptors and so on. And that's something that you do have the power to do in Scotland, and I believe you would have public support to do as well. Then we've got clean air, where I think there's really significant movement as a result of the court case brought by her mum on behalf of Ellie Kissy Deborah, because what that case said, it actually now has air, poor air quality on her death certificate as a contributory factor to her death. And that means local authorities that do not address air quality can be held legally accountable for deaths due to the complications of asthma and other diseases. And so in my patch in Bristol, we've now finally seen the mayor take action on the clean air zone, which we've been pushing for years. And I think in other places that court case can be used to increase that pressure. And obviously in Scotland, we've also got free bus travel for under 19s coming soon. And we need to make that connection between, yes, we want the clean air, but we will provide the public transport so people can leave their cars at home. We need to stress what's positive about this change, not just what we're taking away. And lastly, marine protection, which obviously is also a huge issue in Scotland, and I'm sure you can tell me about that more than I know about it, but it's something else where you have a lot of powers to increase and protect. And I think it's a good time to push forward on those issues now, because I think after COVID, people are ready to hear more radical proposals, but they're also ready to protect nature in a way that they wouldn't have been 2 or 3 years ago. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of make a case for pluralist politics because of what I've seen in the European Union, and because I see the value of having some Greens in the room. We've never been a majority in Europe. When I was there, wish I'd been able to be there longer, because we got up to 10% of the parliament, and that's obviously a significant number. And once you have that number, you have the sort of capacity to cover the policy agendas well. And, it was very noticeable to me that different people brought different things to the discussion, whether it was climate change, whether it was transport. And having Greens there, we are the people that actually have that understanding of ecology and that absolute commitment to really the sanctity of nature and the value of nature in all our lives. And so it's very important to have Greens there in the room. And this is why I feel I've just become a grandma and I'm very busy knitting, and all of those things are great, but it's quite frustrating not being able to actually be an active politician at the moment. Yeah, and I often used to say when I was in the parliament, yeah, fine, I'm representing 5 million people in South-West England, but I'm also representing the beavers and the badgers and the weasels and all those animals. And I felt that very seriously as a politician. And I think that's, that's something that probably set me apart as a Green, that I felt I was a representative on behalf of all species, not just the human species. So yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to hearing more from you and hearing your questions. And it's very nice to be with you here today, particularly because I worry a great deal about what's happening to our democracy in England and the total contempt, really, with which this Conservative government treats most people. What can I say? Obviously, I think you recognise that in Scotland, but it's really representing very few people across the United Kingdom. I think, Jacob Rees-Mogg's facetious comment about happy British fish at a time when in Cornwall and in Scotland the fisheries industry was under incredible pressure because of Brexit, to me sort of sums up the approach we're facing from our government. And I have to say that I think democratic politics is still working in Scotland. Nobody gets everything they want, but I could be wrong, so please don't tell me I'm wrong. But when I look at Scotland, I see a democracy that's still, there's a lot of options. It's working in a pluralist way. You have a much better informed media, I would say, and it gives me hope compared to the rather grim situation for politics in England. So thank you for inviting me to be with you, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. If there's questions I can answer, I'm happy to try to do that as well. Thank you.
Molly, thank you so much for a really thought-provoking presentation, highlighting some of the many challenges we face. I do like this idea of the whole system approach. We often talk about the climate emergency, but we do need to consider nature, wildlife and biodiversity. All the systems are interlinked. I also agree with you that we need to act now, but some of the many challenges, the big game changers, and you mentioned a few of them, things like decarbonisation of the energy network, particularly around improvement to houses, improved energy efficiency, using sustainable energy production. It's so complex and difficult, but yeah, we need to act now. And I do agree with you as well, but looking at local sort of pilots, often what we found is the scalability is difficult, but I think you need to have local, regional and national projects to really deliver on all fronts. So thanks once again, and I'm happy if you're happy to take any questions before you have to run off your next meeting. If you can just use your hands, please.
They don't have to be questions. You can put your point of view as well. Opinions always welcome.
Well, it's the first time I've seen them being shy.
I apologise. I've obviously stunned everybody to silence.
I think it's on the contrary. I think everybody's just digesting what you had said. Before you go, if I could ask everybody to put their camera on just for a second so that we could get a photograph of everybody that was here listening in, that would be great. Come on, don't be shy. Many is that? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20. Oh, okay. Right, Elena, can you take a screen grab of everyone, if that's possible? Okay. You got it? And I've just found out.
I've got it. Sorry, I was on mute. I'm sorry.
I've just found out.
I got them. I don't know if they're.
How
do we look? I don't know how do we look.
Nigel, Councillor Ross from Edinburgh had his hand up for a question, yeah. I think. Councillor Ross, is that right?
Yeah, Frank works just as well.
Oh, sorry.
No, that was really interesting, Molly. But my question was on the carbon neutral side of it. In particular in rural areas, there's a lot of biomass boilers, wood chip boilers that have been installed over the last 5 to 10 years. A big push on that. But where do you see those sitting in terms of the sort of carbon neutrality of heating systems and houses?
That's quite a complex discussion, the whole biomass question, because there's obviously lots of different kinds of biomass, and all else equal, biomass, when it's burned, produces carbon dioxide that was taken in when the wood was produced. So in theory, that should be carbon neutral. But the reality is that often you can have land that's displaced to produce the biofuels, and that happens. Here we have a lot of maize, for example, grown in a very unsustainable way, then to feed not a boiler, but an anaerobic digester. And so in that case, the carbon impact might actually be significantly positive, even though it is still biomass. So I think in a sense you have to do the calculation very specifically. And just to extend on that, when we talk about biomass, an awful lot of what we can do to absorb carbon dioxide is just different land management systems. So people think a lot about tree planting, but if you're just planting trees and burning them, then you're not actually getting any net negative effect. But actually a much more efficient way of doing that is to farm the land in an organic way and to absorb carbon dioxide. The best way to imagine this, I think, is that if you think about the prairies of the Midwest, you know, when the Native Americans were there was really deep soils, like 6 foot maybe of topsoil. And then after 2 or 3 generations of farming, there was the Dust Bowl, and all of that soil had blown away. Now that soil was there holding carbon on the American prairies. Now imagine that was all restored, and instead of growing corn there, they started actually returning that to grassland, or even organic farming with even 2 feet of topsoil. All of that is holding carbon. So, you know, what we need to do with land, and Scotland is a country that has a lot of land relative to people compared to England. And I think the real key to climate change now, it's obviously efficiency of energy and removing the carbon that we're actually putting out there. But we've gone past that stage now. We have to start absorbing carbon back. But we don't need some high-tech system for doing that. Nature will do that if we allow the land to regenerate and if we farm with, you know, building back deep soils. And so to me, that's a really important priority. I'm sorry, I've gone a bit beyond the scope of your question here, but when we think about land management, we have to think about it in a way where it's not simply about what land can do for us, it's also using that land to reabsorb that carbon dioxide. But I would say the specific answer to your question depends a lot on the detail of how that's working. But I'm on this area of energy and electricity, we've definitely got the answers here. You know, it's onshore and offshore wind, a lot of solar. We're well on the way to sorting that, I would say. And Scotland, of course, is making a huge contribution in terms of offshore wind and onshore wind, in fact, and indeed biomass. But biomass can be a very specific part of the picture, certainly in rural areas. And if you look at Germany, then they're actually using a lot of the vegetable and animal waste in anaerobic digesters that they use locally then to feed their local gas grids and electricity supplies. And of course, that also keeps the value in the rural economy. So I think that there's a lot of scope for that in a country like Scotland, I would say.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got time for one more question or comment, if there's any other.
Can I ask a question?
Of course, Stuart.
Molly, thanks very much for your presentation. Really, really interesting. Obviously, we're out of Europe now, which is hugely disappointing for many of us in many different ways. UK government has, in theory, committed to try and keep environmental protection standards to a similar level. Do you, in your heart of heart, believe that, or do you fear a gradual decline in what we're actually going to see?
Well, we can see that what was driving Brexit was a desire to cut standards on environment, on workers' rights, and there was a lot of climate denialism amongst the Brexiteers as well. But as an MEP and working with others, I put a lot of pressure on Barnier to protect standards, and that's what the level playing field that you hear so much about is all about. And so the level playing field says if the UK does cut standards, in a way that then makes it cheaper to produce here at the same time as we're exporting there, then the EU can put tariffs on those goods. And so in a way, well, it does undermine our sovereignty. We've given up our sovereignty to decide what laws we can bring in on environmental and workers' rights issues in return for getting free access to the single market without tariffs. And that was what Barnier put into the deal in order to stop the Brexiteers deregulating here. So it's a little bit weird because we're getting protection through the back door, but that protection is very strong in the case of environment. Of course, it needs to be tested. There's 24 committees to monitor all this kind of thing, and none of them have people on at the moment. So it's something we're going to really have to keep our eye on. And I'm working with my Green European colleagues to say, you know, we're all ready for the first time the UK tries to cut one of these standards, and then we'll take a legal case or, you know, take it through the administrative procedures. So we're kind of primed for that. But I think the deal itself does protect us quite well in the environmental areas. It's much weaker, incidentally, on areas like tax avoidance, which I worked on also a lot as an MEP, where unfortunately, I think, you know, which is another thing driving the Brexit process, as you know, and I fear in that one we're not so well protected. But on climate and environment, at least formally, the protections are there. We will have to, all of us, ensure that they are enforced.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other burning issues? No. Molly, can I just thank you once again for taking time out your very busy schedule to come to the AGM tonight. It was such an interesting presentation, and just like to finish with wishing you all the best in the May elections. And you can continue to stay on. If I know you've got another meeting to go to, but happy for you to stay on until you need to head off. But thanks once again.
I'll head off and get something to eat now, but just say thank you very much. It's really lovely to hear all your accents, if that's not too patronising. Because I only hear
Thanks,
accents
Molly.
exactly like me. So it was very nice to be with you, and I wish you well for your future, for the rest of your meeting and for your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Yes,
Thanks.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. You might hear from us again soon. We might
That'll
ask,
be a pleasure.
we might ask you to speak at a future event.
No problem. And I'll be in Glasgow as soon as I can. Don't worry. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Claire.